The Hollywood icon once seemed untouchable. Mel Gibson had the face, the swagger, the box office power, and eventually the Oscar-winning credibility that made him one of the most recognizable men in American cinema. From Mad Max to Lethal Weapon and Braveheart, Gibson built an image of fearless masculinity and almost impossible success. But behind that golden surface was a career increasingly defined by something far less comfortable. Explosive conflicts, damaged relationships, and public accusations that changed the way Hollywood looked at him. And that is why the question surrounding his supposed list of enemies is more complicated than the headline suggests. There is no reliable evidence that Mel Gibson has publicly announced a definitive list of 5 Hollywood stars he absolutely despises. That claim appears to be a sensational framing rather than a documented statement. What can be examined, however, are the real people whose relationships or public encounters with Gibson became deeply contentious, controversial, or impossible to ignore. Some involved direct disputes. Others involved accusations Gibson denied. And one of the most extraordinary cases began with a project that was supposed to tell a story of Jewish history, only to collapse amid a bitter argument between Gibson and celebrated screenwriter Joe Estehez. That confrontation would expose just how volatile Gibson's Hollywood relationships could become. To understand why these conflicts carried so much weight, you have to understand the man Gibson was before Hollywood turned against him. Born in Peekskill, New York, and raised partly in Australia, Gibson emerged internationally through the Mad Max films before becoming an enormous star with Lethal Weapon. His combination of intensity, humor, and physical presence made him unusually bankable. Then came Braveheart in 1995, a film Gibson directed and starred in. It won 5 Academy Awards, including Best Picture, while Gibson took home the Oscar for Best Director. Suddenly, he was no longer simply an action star. He had become one of Hollywood's most powerful creative figures. That success made the later collapse feel almost impossible. In the 2000s, Gibson continued directing and producing ambitious projects, most famously The Passion of the Christ. But controversy followed him with increasing force. His 2006 DUI arrest and the anti-Semitic remarks attributed to him during the incident became a major turning point. Gibson later apologized for his behavior and acknowledged the remarks, while the incident intensified scrutiny that had already been building around him. Then came another series of public controversies, including accusations from Winona Ryder about remarks she says Gibson made at a party years earlier. Gibson's representative denied her account. The important point is not to turn disputed stories into certainty. It is to understand the pattern. Gibson's public image had become inseparable from conflict. And eventually, those conflicts reached directly into his professional relationships. The Joe Estehez episode was particularly explosive because it involved a screenplay, a major studio, and a historical subject that carried enormous personal and cultural significance. Their disagreement would become more than a failed movie. It would become a window into the question viewers still ask today. When Mel Gibson clashes with another Hollywood figure, what happens when the cameras stop rolling? And there was another reason these stories mattered. Gibson was not an ordinary actor arguing with another performer. For years, he had possessed enough influence to make projects happen, attract talent, and shape the conversation around his films. When that influence began to disappear, every confrontation carried a different meaning. The question was no longer simply who Gibson disliked. It was whether Hollywood had decided that man who once seemed untouchable could no longer control the story around himself. For years, Mel Gibson occupied a place in Hollywood that few actors ever reach. He could open an action movie, direct an epic, command large budgets, and turn personal material into global box office success. He was tough without looking manufactured, charismatic without appearing polished, and willing to take risks that many established stars avoided. But the same qualities that helped create his legend could also make his relationships combustible. His partnership with Danny Glover in the Lethal Weapon films became one of the defining screen relationships of the era. Their chemistry was effortless, and audiences embraced the contrast between Gibson's reckless Martin Riggs and Glover's measured Roger Murtaugh. Yet Gibson's reputation increasingly extended beyond his performances. He became a director with enormous creative ambitions, and his films revealed a willingness to tackle subjects Hollywood considered risky. Braveheart transformed him from action star into Oscar-winning filmmaker. The Passion of the Christ, released in 2004, became a remarkable commercial success despite its controversial subject matter. But success could not shield Gibson from the consequences of his behavior. The 2006 DUI incident became a devastating public relations crisis. According to reports from the arrest, Gibson made anti-Semitic remarks, and he later apologized for them. The episode did more than generate headlines. It changed the context surrounding everything he did afterward. Suddenly, interviews, friendships, professional disagreements, and old stories about Gibson were being viewed through a much harsher lens. That shift became especially important because Gibson was no longer dealing with controversy. In Hollywood, reputation is part of the business. Studios need actors who can attract audiences, directors need collaborators who trust them, and stars depend on professional relationships that can survive pressure. When a celebrity's public image becomes damaged, even disagreements can acquire a completely different meaning. One of the clearest examples came years later through screenwriter Joe Estehez. Gibson had been attached to a project about the Maccabees, and Estehez was hired to write the screenplay. Instead of becoming another Gibson production, the project ended in a bitter dispute. Estehez later accused Gibson of making anti-Semitic and threatening remarks during their interactions. Gibson rejected those accusations and said Estehez had failed to deliver an acceptable screenplay. The argument became public, and Gibson released a letter criticizing the writer's work and defending himself. Neither side emerged with an uncomplicated victory. Estehez had his accusations in the record, while Gibson insisted that the central issue was the screenplay. Their conflict demonstrated how quickly private professional disagreements could become public battles once trust disappeared. And Gibson's controversies did not stop there. Actress Winona Ryder later described an alleged encounter from years earlier in which she said Gibson made offensive comments about her and another guest. Gibson's representatives denied her account. Again, the details remained contested, but the story added another layer to the complicated public portrait surrounding him. By this point, Gibson's Hollywood story was no longer simply about the films he made. It was about the people who challenged him, the accusations he rejected, and the relationships that deteriorated under pressure. Yet the most interesting conflicts were not always the loudest ones. Some involved people who had once occupied the same Hollywood circle, or represented a different side of the industry. And that is where the story moves from general controversy towards specific rivalries. Because once Gibson's career entered its most turbulent period, certain names began appearing around the arguments, accusations, and battles that followed. The next chapter takes us to the turning point, where the difference between a Hollywood disagreement and a career crisis became impossible to ignore. By the time Mel Gibson reached the second decade of the 21st century, the Hollywood conversation around him had changed completely. The man who had once been marketed as one of the industry's most dependable leading men was now surrounded by questions about judgment, accountability, and whether his career could survive the controversies attached to his name. Yet one of the strangest aspects of Gibson's story was that the biggest battles were rarely simple stories of two celebrities refusing to get along. They were often collisions involving trust, reputation, creative control, and the consequences of words spoken when relationships had already begun to fracture. The Joe Estehez dispute became one of the clearest examples. The two men were connected through a proposed film about the Maccabees, a project Gibson hoped to develop. Estehez, known for writing major Hollywood films, was brought in to write the screenplay. But the collaboration deteriorated badly. Estehez later made serious allegations about Gibson's behavior, including claims that Gibson had made anti-Semitic statements and threats. Gibson rejected those allegations and argued that Estehez had failed to produce a satisfactory script. Then the private disagreement became public. Estehez released a recording and described what he believed had happened during their interactions. Gibson responded with a lengthy letter defending himself and attacking Estehez's professional performance. The proposed film eventually collapsed, leaving behind something much more damaging than another abandoned Hollywood project. It became a public demonstration of how quickly Gibson's professional relationships could become adversarial. But the story did not end with one screenwriter. Gibson's reputation was now influencing how audiences interpreted almost every new controversy. When Winona Ryder later described an alleged incident involving Gibson, the story immediately attracted attention because it fit into a broader public debate about the actor's behavior. Gibson's representatives denied Ryder's allegations. The disagreement remained unresolved, but it illustrated a larger problem facing Gibson. Even accusations separated by years could become part of the same public narrative. Then there was the highly publicized relationship with Oksana Grigorieva, which produced another devastating chapter. In 2010, recordings from their relationship became public, containing Gibson's disturbing and offensive language. The recordings generated enormous international attention and led to criminal proceedings. Gibson ultimately pleaded no contest to a misdemeanor battery charge related to Grigorieva. The legal consequences were serious, but the reputational consequences were even broader. For someone whose screen persona had been built around strength, control, and authority, hearing those recordings created a shocking contradiction. The heroic image audiences had watched for decades collided with a private world that sounded angry, threatening, and deeply unstable. Gibson later acknowledged that he had behaved badly and sought professional help. But Hollywood rarely forgets moments that fundamentally change how a star is perceived. The consequences affected his career. Major studio opportunities became less frequent, and Gibson spent years working outside the center of Hollywood's mainstream spotlight. Yet something unexpected happened during this period. Instead of disappearing completely, he slowly began rebuilding his professional life. Directors and actors continued working with him, and eventually he returned to major projects. That comeback makes the story more complicated than a simple tale of cancellation. Gibson had not become universally accepted again, nor had every controversy disappeared. But the industry demonstrated that Hollywood could sometimes separate an artist's professional value from the scandals surrounding him. Still, one question remained. If Gibson's career could survive the controversies, what did that mean for the people who had fought with him? Were they simply casualties of his turbulent reputation, or had some of them become symbols of deeper disagreements that Hollywood itself never fully resolved? The answer becomes clearer when we look at the people connected to Gibson's most controversial chapters, and what happened after the headlines finally faded. The collapse of the Maccabees project with Joe Eszterhas demonstrated that difference perfectly. What began as a creative collaboration became an extremely public dispute. Eszterhas accused Gibson of offensive and threatening behavior. Gibson denied the allegations and maintained that the screenplay itself was the central problem. The project disappeared, but the argument remained part of Gibson's public history. Then came the recordings involving Oksana Grigorieva. Unlike many celebrity disputes based primarily on competing accounts, the recordings gave the public an unusually direct glimpse into a relationship in crisis. Gibson's language was disturbing, and the backlash was immediate. He later pleaded no contest to a misdemeanor battery charge involving Grigorieva. Whatever explanation surrounded the relationship, the recordings changed the conversation about Gibson permanently. Hollywood's reaction was severe. A performer who had once represented commercial power suddenly represented risk. The industry had seen controversies before, but Gibson's case was particularly damaging because the incidents appeared to reinforce one another. Each new story made the previous one harder to dismiss as an isolated mistake. His earlier comments, later accusations, and personal controversies became connected in the public imagination. Yet Gibson's story did not follow the ending many people expected. He did not disappear. Instead, he began working gradually again. Directors continued to cast him, actors continued to collaborate with him, and audiences showed that their relationship with controversial stars could be complicated. His return was not an erasure of the past. It was a test of whether professional redemption was possible after extraordinary public damage. One of the most significant steps came with Hacksaw Ridge, the 2016 war drama Gibson directed. The film received 6 Academy Award nominations, including Best Picture and Best Director. Gibson did not win, but the recognition itself was remarkable. Hollywood had once again placed him near the center of its awards conversation. That comeback revealed something uncomfortable about the entertainment industry. Hollywood can condemn a person publicly while still leaving room for professional rehabilitation. Talent, box office history, relationships, and the desire for a successful project can all influence how quickly doors reopen. But that does not mean the people involved in Gibson's controversies simply vanished from the story. Despises continued to stand by his account. Ryder's allegations remained disputed by Gibson's representatives. Grigoreva's relationship with Gibson ended amid legal and personal consequences. And Gibson himself has spent years attempting to move beyond a reputation that was once defined by extraordinary success and later overshadowed by extraordinary controversy. That contradiction is what makes the story so compelling. Gibson did not merely fall from Hollywood's good graces. He eventually returned to a version of the world that had rejected him. But the return came with a permanent condition. The old image could never be completely restored. The smiling action hero, the Oscar-winning director, the controversial figure, and the comeback story now exist simultaneously. And that leaves the final question. After everything that happened, did Hollywood truly forgive Mel Gibson? Or did it simply decide that his talent was too valuable to ignore? The answer is probably somewhere between those two extremes. Hollywood did not erase what happened to Mel Gibson, but neither did it permanently close the door. His later career shows something complicated about fame. Public condemnation can be powerful without becoming exile. Gibson's return was never simply about proving that the past had disappeared. It was about demonstrating that he could still contribute as an actor and filmmaker. Hacksaw Ridge became an important part of that process. The film earned strong reviews, major awards attention, and 6 Academy Award nominations, including Best Picture and Best Director. For Gibson, the recognition represented a comeback that once seemed unlikely. But a comeback is not the same thing as a clean slate. The controversies remained part of his biography. His anti-Semitic remarks during the 2006 DUI incident could not simply be removed from history. Neither could the 2010 recordings involving Grigoreva, the resulting legal proceedings, or accusations made by people such as Despises and Ryder. Some claims were denied or disputed, while other events resulted in documented legal consequences. Those distinctions matter because Gibson's story is complicated enough without turning allegations into facts. It also changes the meaning of the original question. Who did Mel Gibson absolutely despise? The evidence does not support a verified list of 5 Hollywood stars that Gibson publicly named in those exact terms. What the record does reveal is more interesting. A career repeatedly shaped by conflict. Sometimes the conflict was creative. Sometimes it was personal. Sometimes it became legal. And sometimes the disagreement was amplified by enormous public attention surrounding one of the most recognizable actors of his generation. Gibson's Hollywood relationships cannot honestly be reduced to 5 enemies. They are chapters in a larger story about fame, accountability, reputation, and survival. There is also a lesson in the way audiences responded. Many viewers who had grown up watching Gibson as Mad Max, Martin Riggs, or William Wallace had to reconcile those characters with the man behind them. That is the strange power of celebrity. We spend years believing we know someone because we watch them perform. Then one event can expose how little we knew about their private behavior. Gibson's career ultimately survived, but survival came with a permanent shadow. He continued acting and directing long after his most damaging controversies. His professional opportunities returned, but the old innocence surrounding his public image did not. And perhaps that is the real answer hidden behind the sensational headline. The most shocking part is not discovering 5 people Gibson supposedly hated. It is discovering how quickly extraordinary success can become a liability when a star's private conduct collides with the public image that made him famous. Mel Gibson remains a complicated Hollywood figure, enormously talented, controversial, accountable for some actions and the subject of disputed allegations for others. His story is not a clean redemption story, nor simply a story of destruction. It is a story about consequences, reinvention, and the uncomfortable possibility that Hollywood can remember a person's worst moments while still making room for their next chapter. So which moment in Mel Gibson's journey shocked you the most? The rise, the controversies, the collapse, or the comeback? Share your thoughts in the comments. And if this story gave you a different perspective on one of Hollywood's most complicated stars, like, subscribe, and turn on notifications for more untold celebrity stories. His career may never return to the way it was, but the story of Mel Gibson proves that in Hollywood, even after the brightest spotlight turns away, it can sometimes find you again.